Next on AM 1480 WLEA, the Newsmaker Show. Here's Brian O'Neill.
Very glad to have with us our regular Tuesday guest, Dr. Gary Ostrower. We're going to be talking about World War I today. That's the topic that Dr. Ostrower picked out. Good morning, Dr. Ostrower, and why are we talking World War I today? Just curious.
Well, before I answer that question, just let me note that at Alfred University on Sunday evening at 7 o'clock, and this is going to be at Herrick Library at Alfred at 7 o'clock, there is going to be a discussion about World War I. I'm going to be a part of it. Dr. Andrew Kless, who is a European historian, is going to be talking about World War I. He's an expert in that field. We're talking about it because this week, on Sunday to be exact, I suppose the first day of next week, we are going to be commemorating the end of the 100th anniversary of the end of World War I. Some of you may know that the war ended at the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month of 1918, after 4.5 long, very, very bloody years. So this, as I say, is the 100th anniversary of the end of the war, and I'm hoping that, at least as a historian, I hope that you're going to hear a good deal about this in the next 3 or 4 days.
So many questions to ask you today, Dr. Ostrower. Why did World War I begin?
Well, it's kind of complex. It really begins, like many wars, for many, many different reasons. But the most important, in a sense, I think, has to do with the way in which the European continent was more or less organized in respect to different alliances. The Germans did not like the English. The French did not like the Germans. The Russians did not like the Germans. They were a little bit suspicious about the French and the English, I might add. But in any case, what happens in the years, really the 5 or 6 or 7 years before the war begins, is that these different countries ally with other countries just in the out of fear that their enemies may attack them. So better to have alliances, better to have friends on your side, particularly if they are powerful friends. The war really begins in the Balkans, where a lot of wars have begun. The Balkans meaning that area from Greece up into Romania. In this particular case, the Serbs, Serbia, which was an independent country at that time, but was allied with Russia. The Serbs feared the Austro-Hungary, the Austrians. The Austrians wanted territory in that area. They had some, and a Serbian nationalist in July of 1914, a Serbian nationalist assassinated the second in command in Austria-Hungary, what we call the Archduke, the man who would have become the Emperor of Austria-Hungary upon the death of the existing emperor. The Austrians demanded that the Serbs apologize. The Serbs refused to apologize. The Austrians then said, "If you don't apologize, we're going to we have the right, so to speak, to attack you." They gave the Serbs an ultimatum. And when the Serbs let that ultimatum go by without responding, the Austrians attacked. When the Austrians attacked, the Serbs called on the Russians to defend themselves. The Russians then declared war on Austria. When the Russians declared war on Austria, the Germans, who were allied with the Austrians, then declared war on the Russians. When the Germans declared war on the Russians, the French declared war on Germany because they had promised to defend the Russians. When that happened, then of course the Germans began to, they launched an attack against France, and that attack took the Germans through Belgium. Now I know this is very, very confusing, and people are probably shaking their heads at all of this. But when the Germans went through Belgium, the English then joined with the French and the Russians against Germany, or to put it in a different way, a small attack, a small war in the Balkans, between the Serbs on one hand and the Austrians on the other hand, within a period of approximately 7 weeks, became a world war. All of Europe became involved in all of this. And I suppose the most important thing that I can say about this is that this would not have happened. Okay, the Austrians would not have attacked Serbia. They just wouldn't have done it had the Germans not given the Austrians a promise. And the promise was, hey, if anyone attacks you, that is to say, attacks Austria, we're going to defend you. It was called a blank check. Like, and the Germans didn't say, hey, we'll only defend you if you do something smart. They said, we'll defend you no matter what you do, even if it's really dumb, even if it's really, really stupid. And so, with that kind of a blank check, the Austrians felt powerful enough. They felt, that they had backing up. If they attacked Serbia, and as they say, within 7 weeks, the entire continent was engulfed in what becomes one of the greatest wars in world history. By the end of this war, by 1918, there were, approximately, we don't know exactly how many men had died, but somewhere between about 9 million and 11 million soldiers lay dead on the battlefields. In other words, again, a very, very small war turns into a major league war, and it happened within a relatively short period of time. But, Brian, I might mention one other thing. These two sides, what we call the Central Powers, that's Germany and Austria-Hungary and Turkey, which was fighting on their side, and at least at the beginning of the war, Italy, were facing off against the Triple Entente, okay, the Allies, and that was composed, of course, of Great Britain and France and Russia and some of their other smaller allies as well. These two sides were so evenly matched that a war that almost everyone thought would end by Christmas of 1914 was still going on by Christmas of 1915, and then of 1916, and then of 1917, and almost to Christmas of 1918. We make a lot of mistakes. Military leaders often misjudge. Everyone misjudged their opponents during this war, as I say, that on both sides. The expectation was that they would win the war relatively soon, and of course, no one was winning the war for years and years and years.
Presumably, the newspapers at the time that the U.S. got involved with this, or Europe got involved with it before that, presumably the newspaper headlines were not World War I. What did they call the war before it finally got the name World War I?
Well, they called it, for good reason, the Great War. And it remained the Great War until World War II. And then, of course, once World War II began, then we started to view World War I in somewhat different terms. And so, of course, we changed the name to World War I. And I might add, by the way, that there are some historians, and I don't think this is a foolish view, there are some historians who really see World War I and World War II as the same war. In other words, as a war that begins in 1914, there is then an armistice, a truce, kind of a pause for about 20 years, and then it again begins in 1937 in Asia, 1939 when Hitler attacks Poland, and that, of course, that war continues until 1945. The Americans come in late into both wars. In World War I, the United States does not enter the war until 1917. And I want to correct something that a lot of people, I think, misunderstand. When I talk to my students at Alfred University about why the United States entered that war, many of them will say, well, we entered the war because the German submarines sunk the Lusitania, which was a huge, one of the most modern ships, one of the most modern passenger ships that existed on the face of the earth during that period. And when the Lusitania was sunk, not only were approximately 1,200 British people lost, but there were 126 Americans who died in that attack. And of course, our President Woodrow Wilson was outraged by the fact that the Germans would attack a neutral. We were neutral at that time. That was before we were involved in the war, that the Germans would attack a neutral ship. But what we want to remember is that the Lusitania was sunk in May of 1915, and the United States did not enter the war until April of 1917. In other words, almost 2 more years elapsed before the U.S. became involved in the war. Now, to talk about why the U.S. finally did get involved, it has a little to do with the Lusitania. That is to say, American outrage that the Germans were attacking neutral ships. But they attacked many, many, many other neutral ships between 1915 and 1917. It was by no means only the Lusitania that brought the United States to the brink of military hostilities.
Now, recalling Glenn Thomas's European history class here, and Jim Lesherdone's American history class here, some Hornell High School references there. Remembering when you brought up the Lusitania, another thing that I remember from that period in history class was Woodrow Wilson's 14 points. What was that about?
Well, Woodrow Wilson, and this is late in the war, in 1918. The Americans are already involved for about 8 months. But I might add, by the way, that the American involvement did not mean very much for the first, really for the first year. That is, the Americans declared war on Germany in April of 1917, and it's not really until April of 1918 that the U.S. has enough troops in Europe to make any real difference. A few months earlier, Woodrow Wilson had issued the so-called 14 points, which is a way for the Germans to kind of a basis for a peace agreement, that all sides would recognize the freedom of the seas, that all sides would recognize that small countries like Poland and Hungary and so forth had the right to their own independence. The Germans, as a matter of fact, eventually surrendered in 1918 on what they hoped would be the basis of that 14 points, a relatively liberal, a relatively generous peace treaty. But in fact, the Allies, including the United States, insisted on much more onerous terms. But I think to understand why they insisted on such onerous terms, we ought to recognize that World War I was different from a lot of previous wars because the kind of weaponry, the kind of military equipment that was employed was quite different, and therefore a lot more lethal. Many, many, many more men are going to die, as I indicated before. And to give you an example of what I'm talking about, we're going to see during World War I the first extensive use of gas warfare. We're going to see the first use of tanks. The British are going to introduce tanks in 1917. The submarine became an incredibly lethal weapon, and a weapon, I might add, that was instrumental in ultimately triggering American participation in that war when the Germans did sink many of our neutral ships. Machine guns are going to be utilized to a large extent for the first time in World War I, and they were much more lethal than any kind of musket or rifle that had been utilized earlier, even during the American Civil War when over 700,000 men died. Flamethrowers are going to be utilized for the first time in World War I. Planes, to a certain extent used for observation purposes, to a certain extent utilized for good old military bombing purposes, although the bombs were not very effective during World War I. All of this new weaponry really, in a sense, introduces us to the 20th century. And by World War II, it's kind of interesting that during World War II, there really are not a lot of new weapons. What you have is the improvement of the World War I weapons, so that although gas warfare is really not going to be utilized in World War II, except for the way in which the Nazis are going to kill 6 million Jews with poison gas, but tanks are going to become much more efficient in World War II. Submarines, a much longer range in World War II, carrying many more torpedoes. Machine guns, flamethrowers, and so forth are going to be more efficient during World War II. And I hardly need to say that that aircraft. We're going to have long-range aircraft, which didn't exist during World War I. The B-29s that carry the atomic weapons, that carry the atomic bombs to Hiroshima and to Nagasaki, had flown over 600 miles each way. That kind of thing was simply inconceivable during World War I. So, it's one might say it's the same war, but boy, World War II is a much improved kind of warfare, a much more lethal kind of warfare than we had before. And I might say, by the way, that in respect to the American involvement, The Americans fought, they fought quite well during World War I. They fought to the very, very last minute of the war, which is kind of weird because everyone understood the peace treaty, I shouldn't say the peace treaty, the armistice, okay, the truce, the armistice that would end World War I was signed at approximately 5 a.m. on November 11th. And the armistice said that, all right, the war will end 6 hours later. It will end at exactly 11 a.m. All right, everyone understood that the Germans were going to have to cede certain kinds of territory, that they were going to have to make concessions, they were going to have to turn over a lot of their military equipment to the Allies. That was all understood in advance. And yet the Allies continued to fight to the very, very last minute of the war. A young man by the name of Henry Gunther from Baltimore was killed at 11:59 a.m. I'm sorry, at 10:59 a.m., 1 minute before the war finally ended. And, we all knew, everyone knew that the war was going to end at 11 o'clock. It was an absolutely unnecessary death. There were 2,700 men killed on both sides on that last few hours of the war. 2,700 men died. Approximately 8,200 were wounded. Those numbers exceed the number of men on both sides, the Allied side and the Axis side, that died on D-Day during World War II. So, you just got to shake your head at why these commanders did not say, hey, the war is ending in a few hours, we're simply going to kind of stay in place and wait those 2 hours those last few hours peacefully. They fought, and they fought viciously until the very, very end of the war.
We're going to talk about the trenches when we get back. I'm going to take a quick break, check the forecast. Talking with Dr. Gary Ostrower today, the Alfred University longtime history professor. Stay with us.
McCourt's Auto Collision on State Route 36 just south of Canastillo is a full-service collision shop offering not just collision work, but also paint work. McCourt's has a 24-foot frame straightener with 3-dimensional measurement. McCourt's accepts all insurance companies and can work with you on any deductible you may have. At McCourt's, they work for your interest and your benefit, not the insurance companies. All work is fully warranted and they offer a free loaner car. McCourt's Auto Collision, State Route 36 in Canastillo, where customer satisfaction is always number one. Phone 607-698-9900.
Checking in now with meteorologist Gary Best. And our weathermen, they get up early. Gary, have you voted yet?
Yes, I have. I vote for the best, Gary Best.
A selfie write-in. I like that. Hey, how's the forecast looking, Gary?
Yeah, it looks like it's going to be kind of showery out there. We have clouds and showers right now, and there could even be a thunderstorm as well late this morning and early this afternoon. It'll be a breezy and mild day, though, with a high of 60. This morning's sunrise was at 6:51. It's going to set at 4:57 later on today, and we'll have a lot of clouds late today as well. A few showers into this evening. Breezy and turning cooler overnight with breaking clouds down to 40. Then sunshine returns tomorrow with a high near 50. Then patchy clouds Wednesday night. Maybe a light sprinkle, maybe a flurry, low temperature, low to mid-30s, and partly sunny and chilly weather coming up on Thursday with high temperatures in the 40s. Looks like we have some chilly weather coming up this weekend, Brian.
Thank you, Gary. Back with Dr. Gary Ostrower. I had a friend from Hornell High School and went off to college, and I said to him, how's things going with your roommate? This was at the time we were all going off to college. He said, well, my roommate's a history major, and he keeps asking me, if we were in World War I together, who would you rather be in the trenches with, so-and-so or me? And he said he said this went on for weeks, and finally his roommate started to get kind of mad about it because he didn't think that this guy wanted to be in the trenches with him in World War I. And my friend said to me, he said, I don't know how to take this guy. Anyways, not such a funny topic. The trenches in World War I. Dr. Ostrower, that's where a lot of the fighting was done. Am I correct on that?
It was not only done there; those trenches remained in place. There was, World War II was going to be a war of mobility, of movement. World War I was a static war. The Germans remained in their trenches, the French remained in their trenches, and what happened, in a sense, is that it follows the very, very first battle of the war. The Germans swooped into northern France. They assumed they could take Paris in a few days and the war would be over. But the French met them at the Marne River. And the two sides, each, the Germans certainly expecting a quick victory, the two sides didn't quite dig in. but they discover that they're fighting a very different kind of war than they had anticipated. Many of their troops were on horseback, cavalry, and cavalry really meant cavalry, soldiers, on horses. Well, you can imagine what a machine gun is going to do to a horse that's carrying that soldier. And so, within a period of 3 to 4 weeks, over 300,000 casualties on both sides, just huge numbers of men who died. And when they realized, finally, hey, this isn't very smart to stay out there on the surface in the face of machine guns, they began to dig in. They began to dig these trenches. Each side wanted to get to the English Channel first, the Germans, so that the English would not be able to bring new supplies into France, the French to make sure that the English could bring those new supplies in, and by the same token, they also went to the east and to the south, all the way to Switzerland. So you had what we call the continuous warfare. You had the continuous trench, so to speak, that existed, the length of these trenches, all the way from the English Channel to Switzerland. And both sides dug in, and rarely did either side gain more than maybe 200 yards or 300 yards. That would have been taking a lot of territory. Now, by 1918, the Germans launched an offensive in which they went 13 miles in a single day. That was in the spring of 1918. And that was the first time when it became apparent that perhaps this war of this trench warfare was going to turn into a much more mobile kind of warfare. But by that time, the Americans were bringing in many French troops, and the Americans were able to help stop that German offensive in the early summer of 1918. Over the next few months, the Allies, that is to say the French and the Americans especially, to a certain extent with British help, launched a counterattack, and that counterattack finally forced the Germans to surrender in November. And that, of course, is what we're, in a sense, commemorating right now.
Well, an old newsmaker tradition of no current event politics on Election Day. That was a longtime policy of Kevin Doran's. That tradition kept up today by Dr. Gary Ostrower. That was fascinating, Gary. You beat the History Channel any day of the week for me, sir.
Well, hey, you got to. I wish I had the salary of some of those guys on the History Channel there. But it's a fascinating topic, and I tell you, there's a lot more to say about the First World War, and perhaps one of the next programs we're going to have, I'll talk about the Second World War.
Thank you so much, Dr. Ostrower.
Thank you very much.